because I have my reminder to myself to record. And as I say, anybody who is more comfortable being anonymous or just watching later, that's fine. And I'm happy to field any questions later for those who have them. So what I thought I would talk about today is a group of us on campus, and I want to acknowledge one of my facilitators, Sarah Pryor, who's here, who's also a member of the DWC. We decided with all the issues happening at Michigan State that we needed to make some meaningful change. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we did and how we did that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from others how we might keep this going. Honestly, just before COVID, we kind of hit a point where we had to decide whether to keep meeting face-to-face, to move virtual. And so I'm just curious to hear what you all have to say. So just as some background, you probably have heard some of the issues that have happened at MSU. Not just Larry Nassar, but kind of other sexual assault problems, Title IX issues. Our president resigned. Her resignation letter was clueless. She blamed, you know, all the politics and reasons for her resignation without ever taking any of the blame or responsibility on the things that she did, like closing the women's only lounge on campus. We were sued by a professor at University of Michigan Flint. He apparently spends a lot of time suing universities who have women-only spaces or gender-segregated spaces, which have their own issues, I understand, but he's a men's rights advocate. And so we lost not only our women's-only lounge, which also welcomed LGBTQ people, but our Women's Resource Center was shut down as well. So we had a lot of things happening at once at MSU that were very negative in terms of our culture for victims and are just bad. I don't know how else to say it, but things were really bad. And at one point I had reached out to a couple of professors who were very vocal about these problems and who were taking really concrete steps to make change. They were attending every Board of Trustees meeting. They pushed to be elected to faculty council and were just the constant media interviews, organizing protests. And I said, I need to know these people. I need to figure out who these people are and connect with them, because I, like many of my colleagues, were so frustrated that our administration was just doing all the wrong things. So Sarah was one of those people I connected with as well, in addition to our two other colleagues. And we just decided we needed to do something other than rely on top-down change, because really top-down change is not going to happen. The institution protects itself. We wanted to create a grassroots movement among faculty to start changing MSU culture from the bottom up. And for us, what we had control over is our classrooms. So while we can attend board meetings and we can be vocal there and we can be elected to faculty senate or whatever it's called these days, faculty council, there's not a lot of power in some of those institutions. They're just kind of lip service. And so ironically, 10 years ago, I was on a task force called the Faculty Voice Committee at MSU to enhance and strengthen faculty voice. And guess what happened from that? Nothing. So we decided to start with the place where we had control and where we had power, which is the classroom. So we started this group called Teaching and Learning for Institutional Transformation, or TELLIT, at MSU. We held monthly work groups, and we tried to bring in experts to talk about specific topics for each meeting. So we started off with trauma-informed teaching. That what does it mean to come into the classroom with a perspective that's trauma-informed and that's victim-centered? For me personally, I can say that I taught the language that I used to talk about victimization and offending was very rooted in us and them, that victims need assistance because they, right? Or people who offend, they are punished in these ways. Really, it's not us versus them, it's we. And so one of the first things I started shifting was to not other victims in that context, because in all of our classrooms, We have people who have been victimized. We are people who have been victimized. We have students who have offended and who have committed criminal acts, even if they might not recognize that. So for me, having a trauma-informed foundation was recognizing how I use that language. And one of the readings that I started assigning in my undergraduate class is I'm a Criminal and So Are You by Michelle Alexander, that I think is really helpful to get students to put themselves in that place that, yeah, you know what, you've committed crimes. So when we talk about criminals, we're not talking about us versus them. We're talking about all of us avoiding labels and those kinds of things. So I found that very, very useful. So I thought I would share some of the activities and some of the discussions that we've had over the past 2 years, talk about some roadblocks and some concerns for those of you who might be thinking about bringing people together on your own campus. And I'd love to hear from the group about ideas, where we might go, what we might do to keep this moving even in COVID. So, one of the first things we did was pick apart the MSU mandatory reporter language. This is only a light edit of this, and we did this about 2 years ago, and since then I have actually made a heavier edit for my own syllabi. But this is what the original mandated reporter is, the mandatory reporter language that MSU put out in terms of letting students know that we are all mandatory reporters, and this was not always the case. This changed not after Larry Nassar, but I would say after the Penn State issues. MSU decided to go into self-protection mode and make everybody mandatory reporters. So as you can see, the original language here starts, Michigan State University is committed to fostering a culture of caring and respect. Okay, so that's the first problematic statement some of us had with this, because our institution has not demonstrated that they're committed to this at all. So we thought it was better to say, as your instructor, I am committed to fostering a classroom culture of caring and respect, and move forward there. But we do want to make sure that students are aware that we do have to report any instance of sexual violence, even child abuse and neglect if our students are adults. So we changed the language a bit. Again, I have edited this more, but this was one of the first things we did to say, okay, what can we do to change the culture? We can take this boilerplate language that the university comes up with, and we can edit it and change it to maybe be a little bit more, I don't know, realistic. This was our last face-to-face meeting that we had before COVID. We had a really good discussion on challenges faced by international faculty, students, and staff, particularly in light of the anti-immigrant culture that that our current president has been facilitating. And so we had some experts come in, some international international faculty. We talked a lot about what that means, and how faculty from different parts of the world face more challenges and more barriers than others, particularly today with our anti-Mexican language from the president and other kinds of issues. So that was it. That was our last face-to-face meeting. One that I found, I think, the most interesting and useful to me, as I didn't have a lot of knowledge on this topic, was talking about ableism and disability and the challenges faced by students who have a disability, and how they have to navigate campus physically, but then also the issues that they face going on in class. And I would recommend looking at Dr. Chu's work on Google Scholar, that he's written a lot on this issue, and we're really lucky to have him at MSU. But we were basically facilitating small group conversations throughout the year. Thanks to one of my colleagues, we had food. Food is always a good thing. Yeah, this is basically what we've been doing for the past couple of years. Our last virtual meeting, so this was in June, we switched over to a Zoom meeting, was to talk about institutional trauma. Dr. Lucy Thompson is a faculty member at MSU. And those of us at MSU have all been traumatized by this institution, some much more than others. So we talked a lot about trust, institutional trust, how we teach when we feel betrayed by the institution that's paying our salaries, that's hosting our space. So that I felt was a really meaningful conversation to have as well. I thought I would share what we've kind of put together. I envision us moving to an online format, not just because of COVID, but I think that we just had, it's hard to get people together. Oh, there's memes. So it's hard to get faculty to come to meetings. Food helps, but we're all super busy. And so some of the colleagues I talked about, when I said, why don't you come? And they were like, oh, it's Friday. It's my only day I'm not teaching. I've got a faculty meeting in the afternoon. I just can't spend the time. So our group meetings were usually 6 to 8 people. We do have a listserv of about 50 faculty that we share information with, but we were near the end starting to think maybe we need to think about how we change what we're doing. And a lot of our members were asking to put things online. So what we've done is create this webpage where we're trying to put as many resources as we can to help instructors and to think about how we support a positive classroom culture. And I try to get things from Twitter. If you follow Nicole Van Cleve, she has some wonderful resources, and her wellness and health statement in particular is just really useful to get students to think about, self-care, that you shouldn't work so hard to the point of exhaustion. This can create a classroom culture that's more positive, that's more affirming. So these are just the kinds of things we were looking at. Survivor-focused syllabi. There are some great resources out there that I think we're going to be focusing on pulling this together in a more online format. But again, I'm looking forward, when I'm done talking in a few minutes, to hear your ideas on what we can do. We do have a Twitter feed. Oh, that's the DWC feed. I have a lot of Twitter accounts, y'all. There it is. I'm a nerd. I'm a social media nerd. So we have a Twitter feed, which unfortunately I would say I have not really been maintaining since COVID, but we're trying to use this to share information as much as possible. So afterwards, please follow us. As you can see, I had just started it like right before everything shut down. 33 followers, maybe more than that. So we put together these resources that we hope are useful. And just a couple of things to think about as you might move forward at your own institutions is that we were very aware that, again, our institution has failed us. And so when we created this group, we wanted to disconnect ourselves from the institution a bit. So our website is a WordPress site. It's not an MSU site. I created it with my personal Gmail account. And so information goes to that instead of to my msu.edu account. And in the Twitter, in our Twitter bio, I list myself as manager so people are aware that there's actually a person back there. But some concerns that we have and that we've discussed over the past couple of years, that institutional change is just really, really slow. And I'm sure many of you feel like you're just banging your head against a wall when you try to change something at your college or university. It's almost impossible because that's the nature of institutions to some extent. But I have seen that small changes in my own classroom have made positive impacts for specific students. So in our last session, Lisa was talking about pronouns and asking students their pronouns rather than like requiring they have it on their Zoom. I've been asking about pronouns for probably 2 or 3 years in my undergraduate classes, and the students who are non-binary or who are trans always thank me for asking. And for me, that's like the biggest deal ever. And I think it helps to normalize that process, that when I first started asking students for pronouns, I got pushback, usually from white men in the class, who would either make a joke about their pronouns or make a dismissive remark or say things like, well, obviously I'm a male, so my pronouns are he, him. I haven't gotten pushback in a little over 2 years, and I think maybe like a year and a half. I think it's just becoming normalized. And so asking that kind of thing, it helps students from being misgendered and supports LGBTQ students. But I think others are becoming just used to it, that we're making a cultural shift in very small ways. So while we didn't think we could really change much, I think we can. I think we can at least change the culture for individual students, particularly. We struggled a lot with how much we could trust the institution and how much of what we did was, how much is it okay to partner with other aspects, other groups or other organizations on campus, other departments. We've gotten a great deal of support from our GenCen, which is essentially our Women's Studies Center. They've given us meeting space, they advertise our meetings, but there are some units or departments we were kind of cautious about working with. Again, when your institution has failed you, you tend to question the motives of your institution. As the four of us and others have found, and many of you know, there is not a lot of recognition for doing this work. So if you're not, especially in an R1, if you're not publishing and you're not getting grant money, then they don't give a lot of weight to organizing these kinds of things. Teaching can get the short shrift. So make sure, those of you who are here, actually make sure this goes in your annual report today. You are at a meeting that, you know, you're learning about teaching, but there really isn't a lot of recognition for doing this kind of thing, and it can be time consuming. So the positive result is that you're making things better for students. The negative result can be that you're actually making harder for yourself in terms of tenure promotion and getting that kind of recognition. And one thing that we really were worried about was retaliation. Even recording this right now, I feel, you know, a little weird about it. Oops, I'm sorry. I went, well, see, there's retaliation. My computer is retaliated against me. I feel a little weird about recording it, but I just don't care. I'm tenured, and so I have more protection than some of the other people in our group who are on year-to-year contracts. And so we have talked about that, and those of us with tenure need to have that louder voice to speak for some of our faculty who are untenured or who are adjuncts. So our next steps, and again, I'm wrapping up because I did want to keep this short. We're probably going to transition to a more online format, especially in terms of COVID. But, emerging issues, what to Dover, what to cover, that should say. So I would love to hear from you all about what other things are important to talk about with regard to classroom context. I have used the events of this summer. I teach a course on genocide. It's a general ed course. And I have used the events this summer to talk about Black Lives Matter, to talk about institutional racism, to talk about science denial and, you know, the pandemic and the pushback on COVID. But I'm not sure everyone has the opportunity to talk about those things in class. So if you have any recommendations, I would love to hear them in our discussion, or you can email me later. And I think that's probably it. Yeah. So that's my little quick talk. Hey, 20 minutes. Nailed it. So I would love to hear from anyone. I have not been watching the chat box. So feel free to ask questions in the chat or unmute yourself. And I would love to hear any ideas or feedback you have for us.
Erin O'Neill. Hey, Christina, excuse me. Something that I've implemented this semester, so we're in a hybrid format where we can have up to a certain percent of instruction be remote, and then a certain percent face-to-face, or provide an opportunity at least for that face-to-face. And something that I've incorporated this year because of COVID that I think I'll continue because it's just been really successful is holding what I'm calling gender and crime social justice seminars that are additional opportunities for students to opt in to talk about the content in the context of current events. And so we've had discussions so far about Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name. Next week, we're going to talk about the WNBA, kind of their history of fighting for racial justice, and that it wasn't just necessarily this most recent demonstration. Right. And because it's optional, the students who self-select into that are really interested in the topics, and it's just been really successful. And I teach both undergrad classes and they're gender and crime, but it's kind of like a more graduate style learning environment where students are learning from each other and I'm also learning from them, and I've really enjoyed it. So I think I'm going to continue doing it.
That sounds great.
And they seem to like it too.
Love it.
Can I comment on something, Christina?
Yes,
so
please.
First, thanks for presenting this. I think that a lot of us have followed this nationally, what's been going on, but it's nice to hear about what you've been doing. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately personally, so I'm a new administrator, right? I have not been an administrator before. And now that I am a department chair, I'm going to try to use whatever power that I have in this role to reward this kind of stuff that you're doing. So thinking about activist work, thinking about service work, I don't know if this will happen or not, but I'll tell you all, I'm trying to make it almost even where your service could be equal to what your teaching would do, because people are doing important work, but every year when you go up for your evaluation, service is always like, oh, well, who cares? Did they publish anything? What were their teaching evals? So for people who do kind of get into that position of power where you could maybe change it, I think, it's important to do that or use whatever power you have. So I really appreciate all that you've been doing and everybody at MSU.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a struggle, but hopefully we're getting better. It's just right now everything is so upside down with all of us, right? It's just hard to know. Anybody, go ahead.
One other thing that I'm not sure, I got kicked out, so I don't know if you touched on it, but
no.
I think it was important just watching this over the year for graduate students. I think a lot of our at every meeting there were graduate students that would come from a variety of different departments, and I think that for them it was really important to have these conversations. One, because not all schools are great pedagogically training graduate students, right? They're not giving them a whole lot of anything in terms of how to be teachers, how to interact with students, how to navigate this sort of bureaucratic institution that they have to navigate, and then like the student part of it. And so the graduate students, at least the ones I talked to, really appreciated this additional conversation about how do they make space in classrooms, especially because they're in that precarious position where they might be experiencing this from their own department, right? They might be experiencing harassment or minimization or any number of things from the faculty that they're engaging with. How do they then not replicate that in the classroom? And what can they do, especially if they don't feel like the institution is protecting them? So I think it was really valuable for grad students to hear that, to talk to other faculty members, to see sort of how a classroom can look.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And again, I just want to recognize Sarah as one of our 4 co-facilitators here at MSU, and she's a member of the DWC and the Department of Sociology at Michigan State. One of the other things that actually one of the graduate students asked me to work in, and I was going to be working it in for this academic year, is emotional labor by graduate students on research projects. Reading about victimization, reading about homicide, reading about things like terrorism. It's sometimes faculty don't recognize. Some of us are pretty hardened, let's say, right? But we don't always recognize for our grad students and for our readings for undergraduates too, that some of the things we might give them, they're just not prepared for. So we were going to have a talk about grad student research work in particular, and recognition by faculty of how that can be traumatizing, or it just can be emotionally laborsome. So that's definitely something. But I think thinking about the readings that we give our students, the movies we show our students. I tell students in my genocide class on the first day, we're not going to watch any genocide movies this semester. We're not going to watch Hotel Rwanda. We're not going to watch The Killing Fields. And We have a lot to talk about that's emotionally draining. I'm not going to pile on. We're going to talk about genocide as how we study it as social scientists, and try to look at it more clinically than emotionally, because I think sometimes we forget that it can be really traumatic and draining for students. Anybody else have anything that they do in the classroom to have a trauma-informed perspective or a victim-centered perspective?
Christina, I just want to piggyback on what you just said as far as the emotional labor for grad students. I think one piece that is also not often recognized is when we do our research, and as is the case, we often do research with vulnerable populations, and we definitely expose ourselves to vicarious trauma doing those qualitative interviews. And I think that's something that we should make our graduate students aware that is potentially coming, and find ways to address it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's a great point.
When I was a graduate student and working on a large-scale sexual assault case processing project, I was really lucky because one of the co-PIs, Catherine Tellis, was also a social worker. And so we did weekly debriefs, and I always felt really supported. And I think that my experience was not the norm. I think that, and so I try to incorporate that, but I'm not qualified. I'm not a social worker. I don't have a background in counseling. And so I wonder if it would be worthwhile, trying to schedule some type of, like, somebody from the counseling office to come and talk to our graduate students regularly if they're working on projects that have an emotional labor component. Oh, I see Michelle. Go, Michelle. I see your hand.
Hi, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you mid-flow. So I just wanted to talk about, there was a course that I've been involved in teaching, gender advocacy and juvenile justice, where we have undergrads and graduate students working with girls in the juvenile justice system. And I have a practitioner background myself, so I was very concerned about vicarious trauma. So we started off by we had weekly supervision groups with all of the students, and we started off by talking about vicarious trauma and also building in kind of like self-care within all of the kind of lecture part of the course, and especially when we were talking about things like sexual violence, child abuse, those kind of things. We built in kind of 20 minutes at the end to talk about self-care, but also start talking about symptoms of vicarious trauma. And then before they went and actually started meeting with the girls, we had someone come in from the health department on our campus to talk to them about, again, vicarious trauma, but also the resources that were available. And we spoke to them as teachers to say to them, you won't be penalized if you need to use these resources. It's a good thing for you to come forward and say, I had this session with a girl, it was really traumatic, it was really emotional. That's a good thing. Like, you need to tell us when you're feeling those things, or you need to tell us when you're feeling overexposed, or something has scared you, or you've been having nightmares about it. So we normalized it within the classroom to talk about these things because it was such a specialist course, and we built through that for a year. We also made sure that we had consistent TAs and teachers. So we really built the relationship with the students in the class, so that when it came to doing the fieldwork, they could talk about things more kind of honestly.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think Rachel has their hand up.
Hi, yes. So I don't teach, mostly I'm just research, as I'm research faculty, but I have a large research project around the sexual assault kit stuff, and asking people to read rape reports over, all day, every day is extremely difficult to do, especially as you don't have access to victims as well, so you just download bad things. But I've in DWCU and other ways, I think it's important, because the comment I want to make is that I think as researchers, we don't talk about this enough. There's not enough space within often ASC or other meetings for researchers to talk about it. So it's a little surprised that we would then not incorporate it into our classrooms as well, as we try to give the perception of, like, we are scientific, we are these things are just the facts, as compared to really understanding how it can affect us. And by, I think, us talking more amongst researchers about what this is like, as you said, clinicians do a great job of this, but in my experience, sort of sociology, criminology, and other things, they don't do a very good job of talking about these things. So incorporating it into our own academic realms, I think, can really help us figure out important ways to incorporate that into the classroom as well.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think an important component of research is giving guidance to graduate students, whether at the master's level or folks who are working into their dissertation topics. Of course, we all want to choose something that we're passionate about and research directions that we want to go, but helping folks design studies that aren't going to like completely debilitate them emotionally for, or taking an angle on an important issue that gives you enough emotional involvement and enough emotional distance that you can be passionate about it, but you're not completely operationalizing something that is very close to your heart and breaking it down into like these depersonalized chunks. So just giving guidance on research topics and also incorporating like a reflexive practice with master's and dissertation research as well, and just giving folks guidance as they're doing those projects.
And I want to acknowledge a comment from Rosemary. Thank you so much for your comment. And with regard to the genocide films, I totally get it. That yeah, it would be useful to show them, but I worry about the emotional load that I'm putting on students. What I do instead is to show them films that they can apply genocidal concepts to. So I don't know if any of you have seen District 9, film about a spaceship that appears over Johannesburg, right? We watch the first 20 minutes of that before it gets super violent, because that's not a great film to watch from start to finish. There's a lot of emotional work there. But I have them think about the aliens in that film as the other, the us versus them, classification, discrimination, dehumanization, literally, right? They're from another planet. I have them look for themes in other kinds of things that are kind of related to genocide, and I try to find other films that don't hit so hard, I guess. But I totally understand your point. Thank you for raising it. There are a couple of stories that I'd like to share, but I don't want to do it while we're recording. So as soon as we feel like we're done discussing the main points, I'll probably stop the recording and leave the last 15 minutes or so for unrecorded discussion. So if you do have something that you want to share but don't want it recorded, put it in your pocket and we'll come back. Yes. No.
I had a question for you, Christina, regarding normalizing asking about pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
So just following the previous session that we had, is that something that you do going around and when other people can hear, or is it in a written survey? Like,
I make a point of not forcing anyone to reveal pronouns. They're really for my use to know how to refer to them in class. And so I give an introductory survey. I think I have a copy of it on the webpage, which is just msutellit.com, where I ask them how things like, what name should I use when I call on you? You know, are you Elizabeth? Are you Beth? Are you Liz? How do I pronounce your name, which is important for some international students. I don't want to be embarrassed stumbling over the pronunciation of a student's name in class because I'm unfamiliar with their language. And I just say, what are your pronouns? And these days I get no pushback at all, but in the beginning, it was interesting. I changed my Zoom window, you can probably see, to put my pronouns in after seeing a colleague do it who uses they, them. I thought, what a great idea. I don't have to offer it. And again, I think we're normalizing it the more we talk about it, but I also don't want to put students on the spot in class if they're not ready to share that.
so the pushback you got was on these surveys, like people were writing these things?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, or I think I had a student write like, this is really a stupid question. Of course, he, him, because I'm male. That gives me an opportunity then to contact that student before class starts and say, you know, I'm not sure this is the class for you. You might want to find a different section if you can't respect people's gender identity. And then usually they're like, oh, no, 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 that's not what I meant. Or I was just, you know, joking. And I'm like, it's not okay. And all those students have stayed in my class. They apologized and stayed in. But I just kind of made sure that if we had a small group where they were matched with someone who was LGBTQ, or that I just kept an eye on them, just to make sure that there were no statements made in class that were hurtful, derogatory. But I haven't had anybody drop yet when I pushed back.
I teach at a small liberal arts school, and I would say that I even take it one step further. So like a week before class, I send out an email asking all of those things, but I make it a really broad, like, is there anything that you would want me to know about you? So it's clearly not even pinpointing necessarily pronouns or things like that, but I also get all sorts of extra feedback from them, which is clearly things that are important to them. So like I've had students tell me that they're epileptic, which as a professor is probably good to know, right? In case they have a seizure in class. Or I've had students tell me that they have resting bitch face, where they're like, I am engaged in the class, even though I don't look like it. And so I find that it's an opportunity to not only kind of build relationships based on, like pronunciation. I don't want to stumble through your name. It makes me feel terrible, right? And you're important to me. And so we do those sorts of things. But then I also have ended up getting these other kind of nuggets of information that I didn't expect, which has been incredible. And then the other thing, thinking about trauma in my classroom, and I'm not a gender studies faculty member. And so I was teaching a women in crime class, and most of those textbooks, because I relied on, the basic intro textbook to get me through, started with victimization and then led into offending. And I think sometimes it's as simple as flipping the content. And so I actually started with the second half of the book because I didn't want to start on week 2 with these particular experiences and everything like that. And so it gave me like half the semester essentially to build a rapport with my students. And so I understand on the scholars end why they started that way, but it didn't actually work for my classroom and building a relationship, because eventually there was students who had traumatic experiences that I brought up, and they felt comfortable coming to talk to me because it was 8 or 10 weeks in when we started to talk about it, and I could lead up to it. And so I think sometimes it is as simple as that, like thinking through like, okay, yes, all of these textbooks really do start with victimization and then go to offending, but is that what I need?
Yeah, that's great advice, to not necessarily follow the text, but to try to think about building that rapport and that trust in the classroom first. But then again, you also have to, for us as mandatory reporters, students used to tell me all the time about victimization. Now I have to tell them not to. That's a challenge when talking about victimization as well.
Well, and knowing who your non-mandatory reporter is on campus is huge, because every campus does have that person who students can talk to, who doesn't have to report. And so just even leading in with that, being like, if you tell me, I have to tell. But if for whatever reason you really just want to go talk to somebody, here's who that person is, and connecting them.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm going to do is stop recording, because I'd like to share a couple of things that I don't want kept. And then if anybody has anything else they'd like to say that's not recorded, that's fine.